the second year of the pandemic, the stress of quarantine caused me to stop taking care of my hair the way I should have. My hair, which required intense TLC because it's chemically colored, broke off. I'm still slowly going through periods of neglecting it and growing it back, trying to resist the urge to chop it all off like I first did 11 years ago, wondering if I want to go back to my natural hair color, considering dyeing it back my favorite fuchsia, thinking about finger waves, and also mourning the length my hair was back before the worldwide pandemic impacted my mental health. Before you fix your well-meaning fingers to offer suggestions of what I should do, I'm not asking for them. Hair is personal, and for Black women, it's often a political signal or justification for someone to make assumptions about our character. But the personal nature of our hair is not up for debate, and researching and writing this video has made that abundantly clear. It was so hard to fit this very full history into an hour-long video, but I tried my best. How natural is the Afro? How did enslaved women keep up with their hair? How was Black women's hair a trending topic long before social media? What had Angela Davis annoyed with Vibe magazine? How is America discriminated against Black hairstyles? And who are the most memorable Black hair icons over the years? We'll explore all that and more. So sit back and get comfortable. It's time for a Black women's history of hair. Curly and kinky hair that existed in Africa was a result of evolution, providing better ventilation in hot climates and insulating the head from the intensity of the sun. By the 15th century, hair was a tool of communication in West African societies among the bulk of the people who would later make up those kidnapped in the slave trade. Among the Wolof, Mende, Mandinka, Fulani, Yoruba, and others, hair could communicate marital status, religion, ethnic identity, age, wealth, and rank. Some clans even had their own specific hairstyle so that one could look and see immediately what family they hailed from. Among Wolof people, girls who were not of marrying age partially shaved their heads, and recently widowed women stopped doing their hair for a while to de-beautify themselves in a society where hair was central to identity and beauty. How central? Having unkempt or messy hair could translate to being sad, having loose or no morals, or being dirty. The natural hair that we think of today, unbound, long, unruly, free, was not the norm in most cultures. Basically, if your hair wasn't done, it meant something was wrong. Additionally, the importance of hair was demonstrated by the fact that it was sometimes used for rituals and spells or as talismans for protection. Because hair was so important, the hairdresser was revered in these societies, especially because the grueling work took hours or even days. Clearly, hair was practically, socially, spiritually, and aesthetically significant to our ancestors, just like in many cultures around the world. So it's especially devastating to know that to mark their status as anonymous non-human merchandise, or chattel, most of the 20 million men, women, and children sold into slavery were shaved bald. Earliest years of slavery, when new people could be shipped in from overseas, meaning keeping enslaved people alive was not a priority, there was no regard for hygiene or hair care. Ringworm outbreaks were common and made worse with tightly tied rags used to cover the scabs. On some plantations, enslaved women were not allowed to wear anything but scarves. Colonial Louisiana enacted the Tignon law in 1786, which required Black women to wear headscarves to make them less attractive to white men. The scarf was to be worn by the free and the enslaved Black women to dehumanize all of them. Free Black women often decorated theirs or used expensive fabric, and the Tignon briefly became a trend among white women, allegedly beginning with Napoleon Bonaparte's wife Josephine. The Tignon law was no longer in effect after the U.S. took control of Louisiana in 1803, but it's no surprise that in the centuries after, headscarves and bonnets on Black women have continued to be considered low class. Enslaved people who worked in the big house or in other positions that put them in close proximity to whites were usually light-skinned and had less kinky hair and higher expectations to keep it neat. Without access to proper hair care, many enslaved people resorted to using toxic substances like kerosene, butter, and animal fat like hog lard on their fragile strands. And because they didn't have combs like the ones used in Africa, they used a sheep fleece carding tool a lot. And for many, hair maintenance meant frequent braids, scarves, and dry misshapen afros. Damaged, kinky, and curly hair was regularly denounced, especially when in comparison to the tresses of the people born from rape and exploitation from white enslavers. Colorism was compounded by this comparison of good versus bad hair, and black women who were mixed with white or native blood often had wavier and or longer hair, which was noted by several interviewees in the enslaved narratives. The concept of good hair, which was straight or wavy, long and unkinky, versus bad hair, kinky, curly, and or short, materialized. Good hair became a fantasy and desire for some. Like, for example, in a Bible story, 75-year-old formerly enslaved woman Jherri Moore was told by her father Isaac on a Winsboro, South Carolina plantation. She recalled, Adam was a black man, Eve was ginger cake color, with long black hair down to her ankles. That Adam had just one worriment in the garden, and that was his kinky hair. Adam played with Eve's hair, run his fingers through it and sigh. Eve couldn't do that with his kinky hair. In this retelling of the Garden of Eden, Eve was told by the snake that if they both ate the forbidden fruit, Adam's hair would grow as long, as black, and straight as Eve's. According to Isaac and Jherri Moore, Adam choked twice, gained an Adam's apple, and woke up the next day white. In this fusion of folklore and religion, along with internalized hatred of black features by the 19th century, we see that enslaved people were carving their own black American identity. This culmination of past African traditions and contemporary survival tactics would help some of them visualize a future after slavery and kindle a desire and hope for freedom. But it would also impact our beliefs and behavior in centuries to come. After the end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, suddenly it was more important for domestic enslavers to have healthier appearing people for sale. And by some accounts, grooming standards improved as more enslaved were given Sundays off. Several enslaved people recalled only being able to do their personal chores and maintenance, including their hair, on Sunday. For the enslaved who attended church services on this holy day, being extra careful about appearance for the occasion was common. Some enslaved people mentioned doing their hair for other special occasions, like one woman named Sina Moore, also in Winsboro, South Carolina, who mentioned putting sweet shrubs in her hair on her wedding day and marveling that it held them all night and the next night too. As the ability to put time into one's hair grew slightly stronger, granting a sense of pride, the removal of hair as punishment was common. A Mrs. Julia Rush from St. Simon's Island, Georgia, noted that when her enslaver's wife incorrectly thought she was, quote, being intimate with her husband, she cut off all of Julia's long and straight hair. Recalled 97-year-old Victor Duhan, his mother, who was an enslaved hairdresser in Lafayette Parish, Louisiana, was told by her enslaver's son that he would shave her head if she didn't do what he wanted, before forcing her into a sexual relationship. Clearly, hair was important. Hair was sacred not just in a way that spoke to one's humanity, but it also was used by hoodoo conjurers and practitioners on plantations. One man mentioned in Texas that conjurers would mix hair and brass nails and thimbles and needles. It has also been said, though it's not verifiable, that some enslaved people who ran away used braids for maps or to transport food. Meanwhile, among free black populations in Boston and Philadelphia, black people who did their hair in similar fashions to white people, whether to imitate for respectability or because they thought it looked good, were mocked and criticized as uppity or pretentious in the emerging minstrel circuit. There were early free black hairdressers who made good money servicing white clientele. Think voodoo priestess Marie Laveau in New Orleans, who collected tea from her clients and used it for the basis of her conjure work and blackmailing. Emancipation, many of the free black people who had been so before the war quickly found a way to reestablish a social hierarchy, calling themselves bona fide free. In their marriage rules and some established clubs and churches, physical requirements, light skin, and good hair were unfortunately all too common. There are stories of clubs and churches performing not just paper bag tests to perpetuate colorism, but comb tests in which combs had to smoothly pass through a potential member's hair. This same rejection of mono-racial black features was also seen in mainstream white society, where kinky and braided hair was negatively associated with slavery. In the late 19th and early 20th century, advertisements for skin lightening and hair straightening abounded. Concurrently, black innovators searched for a way for black women to get the coveted straight hair. There was no mass market of goods for black women, especially those far in the country, to do their hair with. Just as during slavery, breakage and baldness from high stress, nutrient deficiency, poor hygiene, and a lack of resources was common. So was experimenting. Some women mixed lye and potato for straightened hair with disastrous results. In Texas, a man named Oliver recalled his mother and other women fishing for eel, stripping the skin off and wrapping it around their hair to make it curly. Among older black women in the South who had lived during slavery, they were perfectly satisfied with braids or hair coverings. A bunch of WPA and slave narratives detail the formerly enslaved women having snow white or white hair arranged in braids or nightcaps that enveloped their heads. In 1937, Durham, North Carolina, a one Miss Johnson was described almost admirably as small and dainty with perfect features and snow white hair worn in 2 long braids down her back. She wore enormous heart-shaped earrings, apparently of heavy gold. Braids and hair coverings would continue to be associated with the survivors of slavery. It would be notable when the first black woman, Cicely Tyson, appeared on TV in braids in 1962 because most black women outside of rural areas did not publicly wear braids. And hair coverings were used in post-antebellum advertisements for products meant to stir nostalgia for the good old days of enslavement, like Aunt Jemima, which was founded in 1889. From the Reconstruction era onward, there was a burgeoning market of black women desiring straight hair for styles like the Gibson Girl upsweep. Having such a hairstyle meant one had the time and resources to maintain it, which could translate to respectability. In the few black publications of the early 20th century, like Half Century magazine and the Colored American magazine, black women's hair was straightened, projecting an ideal and reflecting desire. Complained educator, activist, and feminist Nannie Helen Burroughs in 1904, "What every woman who straightens out needs is not her appearance changed, but her mind changed. If women would use half of the time they spend trying to get white to get better, the race would move forward." That was said in 1904? That sounds a little familiar to me. In 1900, Mary L. Johnson and her doctor husband began selling Johnson's hair food from Boston and eventually opened a beauty school and hair store. Their products, ranging from 25-cent itch cure or shampoo paste to 50-cent hair grower, would be advertised in Alabama, Virginia, Missouri, and Colorado. And sometime between 1905 and 1909, Garrett A. Morgan, the future inventor of the precursor to the gas mask, noticed the chemical he was using inadvertently straightened curly wooden fibers. Morgan would go on to manufacture and distribute hair straighteners and other hair care products like hair coloring and a hot comb through the G.A. Morgan Hair Refining Company. Hot combs had been invented in France in the 19th century, but didn't catch on in America until the 20th. Garrett had originally sold his hair straightening product to men before finding a strong consumer base in black women. But Morgan wasn't the first black person to tap into the hair straightening market. In 1900, a 31-year-old Illinois orphan named Annie Malone debuted the Wonderful Hair Grower, which she began selling door-to-door in Lovejoy, Illinois. The 50-cent to $1 hair grower was made with Vaseline, sulfur, orris root, quinine, and bergamot oil. Malone named her business Poro, which has been linked to a Mende word meaning devotional society. Malone created an empire by teaching women around the country, especially in the South, how to sell and use her products, offering incentives like jewelry and gifts. Those who completed the Poro training courses recruited others and opened salons and their own beauty schools. In Cleveland, Poro graduate Edith Wilkins opened the first Wilkins School of Cosmetology. Another Poro recruit and later saleswoman was Sarah Breedlove, aka Madam C.J. Walker. By some disputed accounts, Madam C.J. Walker took the Poro formula and started her own company, an empire. In 1909, she unveiled her own line of hair grower, pressing oil made with Vaseline and ox marrow, veggie shampoo, pomades, and a straightening press and curl kit called the Walker System. The kit included a modern hot comb, which I know many of us had the misfortune of being burned with while sitting between somebody's legs. With these three entrepreneurs, it's clear that the goal of the early beauty market was to provide affordable and safe options for black women to blend into the status quo, not challenge it. But as authors Ayanna D. Bird and Lori L. Tharps pointed out in Hair Story, Untangling the Roots of Black Hair in America, which is a great book, Madam C.J. Walker didn't care so much about women having straight hair as much as she cared about giving them the means to feel good about themselves, and of course turning a profit while doing so. She and other hairdressers of the early to mid 20th century would stress that they treated hair rather than straightened it. So remember how I said there were arguments about straightening hair? The demonization of the lucrative and expanding black hair care industry as being self-hating and or frivolous was reflected in Booker T. Washington's decision to keep hair care instructors out of Tuskegee Institute and hair care business businesses from the National Negro Business League. Booker T. Washington, like many of his contemporaries, was sexist, so it's no surprise that a female-dominated industry would be scoffed at. Madam C.J. Walker was ignored at the 1912 NNBL convention, despite her industry's profitability. Sadly, she would die during her company's peak in 1919. As Black Americans migrated north during the Great Migration and Black urban hairdressers rose in number, beauty politics about straightened hair and lightened skin became more debated. "Don't remove the kinks from your hair, remove them from your brain," wrote Marcus Garvey. But Black women needed money, and when seeking jobs in urban centers or when looking for employment in the rural domestic market, some often had no choice but to conform to racist and intracommunal expectations to straighten their hair. But from another perspective, if we consider the amount of hair manipulation among Black women in pre-colonial Africa, the desire to wear a style, even if it was wrapped up in politics, isn't shocking. Nor is it shocking that once hair was straightened, Black women put their own spins on styles, and they weren't outright copying the white mainstream. Think of 1920s finger waves, which originated in white women's marcelled waves, popular in the flapper aesthetic. God, I love finger waves. To get these fresh styles, going to the local beauty shop for hair maintenance gradually became a popular weekly to bi-weekly expense, so Black barbershops and beauty salons flourished. One 1920 edition of the Blue Book, a Black-owned business directory of Chicago, listed 211 barbers and 108 beauty salons. In Harlem in the 1920s, there were anywhere from 121 to 165 beauty salons in the decade. In a recall to the sacred job and position of hairdressers in pre-colonial Africa, it became common to have lifelong relationships with one's hairdresser and to develop a sense of loyalty to them. These salons and barbershops additionally became centers of political discourse, community building, and important social bonds. These hairdressers were more frequently being trained at Black-owned beauty schools, like Franklin Beauty School, which opened in Houston in 1935. The school was in honor of Madam Nobia Franklin, a Texas native who built her brand with homemade products and an in-home salon. Because Texas required 1,000 hours of training for beauticians, the school thrived and would be the largest beauty school in the South until desegregation. And the school is still open today. Despite the objection to Black women straightening their hair, the average Black woman trying to survive and or feel good about herself was wrapped up not just in racist pressure, but in a desire for community or being on trend, and broader expectations about what we as individuals owed to the Black community, especially as racism ramped up in violent massacres and lynchings through the nadir into Jim Crow. Said an ad in the Oklahoma Eagle, the Black newspaper established after the Tulsa Star newspaper offices perished in the 1921 massacre. "Look your best. You owe it to your race." Most susceptible to the messages about inferior Black hair were, of course, children. Many Black authors, both in real and fictional writing, discussed the desire to be one with the white beauty ideal. Maya Angelou, who grew up in the 30s, recalled in her 1969 autobiography, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, "Wouldn't they be surprised when one day I woke up out of my black ugly dream and my real hair, which was long and blonde, would take the place of the kinky mass that mama wouldn't let me straighten? Because I was really white, and because a cruel fairy stepmother, who was understandably jealous of my beauty, had turned me into a too big Negro girl with nappy black hair, broad feet, and a space between her teeth that would hold a number 2 pencil." According to historian Noliwe Brooks, over 50% of the ads in the most prominent Black publications of the mid-20th century were for cosmetics and hair care products. To be clear, even before this period, while Annie Malone and Madam C.J. Walker made their millions, most Black Americans still used white-owned products. And sadly, after many Black-owned companies folded during the Great Depression and World War II, white companies had an even bigger market share. But there were some promising newcomers like Bronner Brothers, established in 1947, and creators of a long-running trade show and many of the items under Yo Mama and Yo Grandmama's and my bathroom sink. And they still have trade shows today. But back in the 50s, Black women who wanted to achieve the short and sleek looks of Black celebrities like Pearl Bailey, Lena Horne, and Dorothy Dandridge had more products than ever to choose from, thanks to white companies who saw how lucrative the market was. This included not just hair straighteners and creams, but also falsies, which was slang for wigs and hair attachments. Wigs have been used throughout history, from the Egyptians who invented them to 16th to 17th century Europeans, and in Korea, where wigs were reserved for women of a high social status. But the mass production of wigs in the mid-20th century meant anyone could wear one, and for black women there were a bunch to choose from. It was as simple as placing a mail order. A 1947 Ebony magazine article reported that 4 million black women, especially in the Southeast, were buying an average of 2 falsies a year. 10% of these attachments were red, gray, white, or platinum, and the other 90% were blue-black, brown-black, or dark brown locks. It was also mentioned that when compared with the hair attachments available in 1919, these were less kinky, more wavy, finer textured. It's no surprise that next to the article about wigs and attachments is an ad for lighter and lovelier skin. From the 1920s through the 60s, on the campuses of HBCUs, colorism and an aversion to nappy hair was evident in the types of students admitted and those allowed to join Greek organizations. It has been noted that fraternities had color taxes at parties, where men would have to pay more if their date was dark. And our kind of people, Lawrence Otis Graham, raised in the classist circles of the black elite, mentioned fraternity parties where only those with hair as straight as a ruler were allowed inside. In 1949, Christina Jenkins, a 29-year-old with a science degree from Leland College, began developing the nylon scalp base and the technique that would lead to the sew-in. At the time, women often kept weave in place with bulky bobby pins and clips. The Shaker Heights, Cleveland resident filed a patent in 1951 for the Hair Weeve, which formally served the purpose of permanently attaching commercial hair to live hair. Jet magazine mentioned in 1952 that Jenkins caused a trend of women wearing rainbow-colored hair attachments in Cleveland, where she would eventually run Christina's Hair Weave penthouse salon until 1993. By 1964, Jenkins was demonstrating her snap-on hair process in public spaces, like the Ohio Association of Beauticians. But Christina's process was not necessarily accessible for many black women. The process could cost between $200 to $500, or $1,700 to $4,200 in today's money, at various salons who offered the service. In 1969, a British hair salon bragged that it was the only place in England entitled to use Christina's miracle preparation, and Jenkins received a cut of everything. According to a 1968 article that discussed Jenkins' invention being popular among baldies, particularly white men and actors, Jenkins had perfected her invention to, quote, allow Negro women to attach long straight hair to short kinky hair as a substitute for ineffective and frequently chemically dangerous hair straighteners. But the cost of Christina Jenkins' hair weave, which needed to be tuned up every 6 weeks, meant most black women went with wigs. So in the 50s and 60s, black women were seeing themselves represented in a wider variety of ways. From advertising in popular magazines like Ebony and Jet, in the Vintage Beauty Trade magazine, which focused on hairstylist news and products beginning in 1954, to regional black beauty pageants and events like the Ebony Fashion Fair, which was founded in 1958. The Ebony Fashion Fair is of course renowned for bringing high fashion to middle-class black Americans, whom designers ignored for fear that white women would stop wearing their brands if black women were seen in them. And the fashion show traveled by Greyhound bus across the country during 12-week runs twice a year. Unsurprisingly, most of the fashion shows featured straight hair, press and curled hair, and updos. In 1973, Johnson noticed that models mixing foundation to create the right blend for their hues created Fashion Fair Cosmetics, the first cosmetics brand sold globally that catered to darker skin tones. By this period, afros were incorporated into Fashion Fair's advertising and shows. How had the afro gained so much traction? Afros had been on the heads of a few black people, mainly artists, trendsetters, and intellectuals, as early as the 1950s, with dancers like Katherine Dunham, Ruth Beckford, and Pearl Primus rocking them, as well as the rhythm and blues singer Odetta. In the 60s, the community as a whole was discarding the term Negro in favor for black, which people were declaring much more frequently was beautiful. Every year from 1962 to 1972, on August 17th, Marcus Garvey Day, the Grandassa Naturally show featured black women, all with natural hair and, even more importantly, dark skin. There was lots of controversy because we were protesting how, in Ebony magazine, you couldn't find an ebony girl, said Kwame Braithwaite, the creator, a first-generation Barbados foremost American photojournalists and activists who formalized Black is beautiful and helped destroy the term Negro. Jazz singer Abbey Lincoln, another notable artist who rocked an afro early, was a collaborator on the Naturally shows along with other members of the African Jazz Art Society and studios. The Black is Beautiful campaign was needed. Scores of Black children like a young Assata Shakur were used to calling each other Black as an insult, hurling the term nappy and seeing afros as ugly and unkempt. She wrote, "We had never been exposed to any other point of view or any other standard of beauty." The sentiments of Marcus Garvey, Nannie Helen Burroughs, and others were revived and reverberated in the decade of Black power. Initially, to many, wearing a natural meant making a conscious choice to make a political statement. But an afro was not necessarily seen as a natural hairstyle from the motherland by everyone, with the 1970 article quoting an annoyed Tanzanian government-owned newspaper editor who was upset that young African girls were sporting the hairstyle because it comes from Black America. He used Angela Davis's picture to illustrate his point, which reportedly upset Black Americans living in Tanzania at the time. This beautiful expression of Black American beauty was criticized as militant expression of defiance, a shallow trend, and also praised for both. Activist and scholar Angela Davis would complain about the afro devolving into trendiness in 1994, saying, "I'm remembered as a hairdo. It is humiliating because it reduces a politics of liberation to a politics of fashion." Annoyed that a young man didn't recognize her until he remembered her with an afro, she wrote, "It is both humiliating and astounding to discover that a single generation after the events that constructed me as a public personality, I am remembered as a hairdo." Further bristling her brush was the fact that the New York Times had just listed her as one of the 50 top hairstyle trendsetters of the 20th century. But the afro had been commodified and, in a sense, watered down long before the 90s. In 1966, the conservative 11,000 student Howard University crowned its first natural-haired homecoming queen. And 2 years later, the Hilltop newspaper asked its student body if the afro, or the natural, was faddish. An estimated 300 of the 11,000 students were rocking naturals, and one girl said she'd feel like a hypocrite if she didn't wear one, and another one said it was easier than setting it and sitting under a dryer. So for her, it was about convenience and not a political statement. Eldridge Cleaver, the rapist and future Republican, said that Black liberation would be impossible if we did not embrace our crinkly hair. This completely ignored the discrimination aspect. United Airlines fired a Chicago-based flight attendant named Deborah Renwick for having an afro in 1969. Clearly, the choice to wear the afro was subjective, and it was never a guarantee of someone's politics. Wrote Assata Shakur, "You can be a revolutionary thinking person and have your hair fried up, and you can have an afro and be a traitor to Black people." So how are Black stylists coping? After all, Black beauty salons had long been powerful sources of community building, philanthropy, and business investment. For instance, Madam C.J. Walker gave money to the Black YMCA, fought for an anti-lynching bill, gave money for HBCU scholarships, and organized a Black hairstylist convention in 1917. So when naturals came into style, more than a few stylists were a little worried. Wrote historian Susanna Walker, "Some beauty salon owners complained that afros would ruin their businesses, while others rushed to accommodate patrons desiring the style." A 1970 study by the African American Beauty Culturists League found that there had been a 20% decline in beauty salon visits the previous year, with the decline even higher at 30 to 35% in urban areas like New York, Chicago, and LA. Hairstylists needed to adapt, and many went on record in those early years insisting that women needed to get their naturals shampooed, combed, and trimmed properly, or they'd risk breakage. For Black people whose hair does not naturally form afros and white people who wanted to join in on the trend, there was a way to get the look. The self-proclaimed Bush doctor, aka Nathaniel Mathis, began giving people chemically induced afros in 1969. While the afro gained greater prominence than ever before, the vast majority of Black women never wore naturals as a political statement or identified with radical politics, with Afro-American historian William L. Vandenberg estimating 10% of Black Americans supported political separatism and/or the Black Panthers during this period. The afro continued to evolve past its history as a plantation-era necessity, past the 1950s era artist trend, past its brief moment as a political statement, and fully into a style statement into the 1970s, especially in the heady discos and blaxploitation films of the decade. One of the most famous afros of the period was not on the heads of revolutionary leaders, most of them now dead, in exile, or tucked away on college campuses, but on the celebrity and sex symbol Pam Grier, who infamously infamously pulled a gun from her afro in Foxy Brown. In the caricature of blaxploitation films and the rising fashion and beauty industry, afros were definitely no longer representative of black radical power. In 1970, Beauty Trade magazine hosted a natural competition hair show so that barbers and stylists could show all of the ways natural hair could be manipulated. The winning look was the sculpted afro with the widow's peak on the bottom left. Clearly, the natural was no longer so natural. An industry popped up as early as 1969 to provide maintenance for the once radical hairstyle, from glossy picks to afro sheen and blowout kits. Those last two were big moneymakers for the black-owned Johnson Products Company.
She is black essence, and her beautiful natural hair is her crowning glory. Today's beautiful queen uses Afro Sheen. Afro Sheen concentrated shampoo pampers and conditions as it cleans.
JPC began sponsoring Soul Train in 1971, where big and blown out afros could be seen bouncing to the hottest music. JPC would be moving $40 million in product by 1976. There were also, of course, Afro wigs, which Beauty Trade magazine encouraged stylists to sell alongside hair processing services so that women could have more choices and so that they still keep spending money on their hair underneath the wigs. Afromania slowed down by the end of the 70s, and the desire for straight hair remained strong. In 1971, the Dark and Lovely Lie Relaxer was introduced. For years, black women had straightened their hair with products that followed along the vein of Annie Malone's or Madam C.J. Walker's, but heat, water, and sweat always threatened to turn back hair to its original state. The Dark and Lovely Relaxer and products that would follow promised to alter the hair itself, and there were also kitty relaxers on the market. In the same year that Dark and Lovely premiered, Essence magazine, which had been established the year before, featured its first cover girl not in an afro or braids. She had long and straight hair. The Dark and Lovely Relaxer was a hit along with Johnson Products' Ultra Sheen Relaxer, but by the late 70s, women were noticing that these lie relaxers were stripping their tresses of important proteins, leaving it brittle and thin. In 1975, the Federal Trade Commission ordered Johnson Products, which had been selling hair straightening products since the 50s, to create a warning label on its relaxer mentioning the lie. But it didn't tell Revlon to do the same thing for 22 months, which damaged Johnson Products' reputation and helped Revlon gain a leg up in the black hair care industry. Manufacturers would follow up with gentle relaxers made without lye but still toxic products like potassium hydroxide. Into the 80s, as conservatism took hold, discussed in Lectual Does the 70s and 80s, and the employment opportunities for everyone shifted into professional positions and service and retail jobs where hair conformity was expected, the sales of relaxers rose. Hair salons, more numerous than ever, continued to be integral to the black experience as new products and black celebrities rocking trends from the Jherri curl, which was $200 to $300 at a salon but $8 for Proline's curly kit, to the asymmetrical stacked blowout influenced the masses. All the latest looks could be seen at hair shows, which were growing in popularity, like the Hair Wars in Detroit. This popular showcase by David Humphreys, a promoter and DJ, allowed local hairstylists the chance to show off extreme styles in packed clubs. It was camp, and more camp. For real, look at this. This is camp. Black Americans also had their spin on big hair, with lush and voluminous tresses rocked by Oprah, Whitney Houston, Janet Jackson, and Patti LaBelle. In the previous decade, dreadlocks, which have existed for centuries, had become popularized in America by Bob Marley, and in the 80s to early 90s were seen on Whoopi Goldberg, Alice Walker, Tracy Chapman, and Toni Morrison. Toni, who often included themes of colorism, beauty, and self-esteem in her writing, wrote in 1977's Song of Solomon, "How can he not love your hair? It's the same hair that grows out of his own armpits, the same hair that crawls up out his crotch and on up his stomach, all over his chest, the very same. It grows out his nose, over his lips, and if he ever lost his razor, it would grow all over his face. It's all over his head, Hagar. It's his hair too. He gotta love it." While there was more hair flexibility in the 1980s, many businesses and schools continued to be rigid about braids. In 1981, a court case named Rogers versus American Airlines upheld company rights to ban braids. When the plaintiff, Renee Rogers, insisted that her hairstyle was important to herself and black women's identity, American Airlines Airlines claimed that the hairstyle, Fulani braids, was likely inspired by Bo Derek in the movie 10. That hairstyle on Bo Derek caused members of the media to fawn embarrassingly, with Newsweek declaring, "What Farrah Fawcett did for the cascading mane, Bo Derek is doing for braids," echoing sugary and unbelievable commentary that would be thrown at Kim Kardashian's Bo braids decades later. A noticeable portion of white women rushed to get the style, and as it turns out, Bo Derek and her husband lived in a majority black neighborhood, and she definitely had appropriated the hairstyle from the local women because her husband enjoyed the look. Roberta Flack scoffed, "Black women were wearing cornrows long before Bo Derek." This detachment of blackness from our own hairstyle had legal consequences. The court sided with American Airlines and denied that Renee Rogers' hairstyle was culturally relevant, believing that she was influenced by a white woman in a movie. In 1987, when a woman named Cheryl Tatum was fired from the Hyatt Regency in Crystal City, Virginia for refusing to remove her braids, her manager said, "I can't understand why you would want to wear your hair that way." Tatum originally had chemically relaxed hair when she began working for Hyatt, but the damage it did caused her to cut it all off. When it grew back, she turned to braids. Tatum and two other women's lawsuit was dismissed, with the court ruling the Hyatt's rule against braided hairstyles was a part of the original employment agreement, which rested on a Supreme Court case ruling that employees could not bring a civil rights case against an employer for racial discrimination that took place after they were hired. What the fuck? Numerous other workplaces and schools banned braids through the 80s and beyond, with a 1987 New York Times article mentioning the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, American Airlines, and the Marriott Corporation. But black people obsessed with respectability politics also banned braids. The Atlanta Urban League and the Howard University Hospital, for example, banned braids. Complained a business education teacher named Wanda Pearson Jeter, who turned down a job when they said she needed to remove her braids. I question the Urban League as to why they are still perpetuating that blacks must look like someone else and discourage any reflection of heritage. In 1988, Spike Lee depicted the good hair versus bad hair debate, as well as the routine colorism at HBCUs in his cult classic School Daze. The next year, the racist Aunt Jemima image was updated from the cheerful mammy figure wearing a scarf to rocking relaxed tresses, while newspapers mused that hair extensions, costing from $90 to $400, were growing in popularity among black women, with the service even being performed by white hairstylists. The 90s, as I'll explore in Lectual Does the 90s, was a true blossoming of black celebrity culture. In 1992, Hype Hair, the most popular hair magazine, was founded. Style icon Lil' Kim was known for changing her hair color to match her outfits. There were braids on the big screen with Janet Jackson and Poetic Justice, and in the flurry of styles on the small screen worn by Brandy and Moesha. Her braids, particularly her super thin micros, reflected an evolution of the hairstyle. It was now common to use extensions, making the concept of them being natural a little murky. Grammy Award-winning Lauryn Hill, who rapped about silly girls selling their souls and rocking European weaves, proudly wore dreadlocks on the cover of her album and on the red carpet. In the season 2 episode of Sister Sister called Hair Today in 1994, Tamara gets her hair straightened and is treated better by the popular clique in school. That same year, Angela Davis's article about the watering down of the Afro mentions her discomfort with a March Vibe magazine issue, dressing up actress Sidna Williams as her. She wrote, particularly unsettled by Williams recreating her widely publicized FBI wanted poster that made the Afro go viral. "My legal case is emptied of all content so that it can serve as a commodified backdrop for advertising." On the heads of black female celebrities in the emerging celeb genre of video vixens were $2,000 to $10,000 lace front wigs. Remember when cheap lace fronts were $2,000 and held in glass display cases at the local beauty supply store? And on the heads of the women inspiring the celebrities and duping them in lower class environments were yucky sew-ins and quick weaves. Quality human hair, always worn by those who look down on synthetic, was increasingly being shipped in from India and by the 2000s, Brazil, and would be sometimes collected by nefarious or criminal means, causing ethical concerns for some over the wearing of human hair. Also during the 90s, everyone had a mom or a cousin or aunt who rocked the super short cuts with intricate curls and waves, the kind of style that must be adoringly maintained obtained monthly or even bi-weekly. This meant the relationship between the hairstylist and the client was at strong levels. I remember sitting with my nana for her twice-a-month hair appointment growing up. Her hair lovingly cut, colored, and styled by the same woman for over 15 years. The kind of client-customer relationship where they knew each other's families and exchanged Christmas and birthday gifts. Speaking of hairstylists, at the end of the 20th century, the government was increasingly cracking down on black people's abilities to braid hair professionally. Braiding is unlike other hair care services that require chemical use and knowledge, tools, or cutting off hair, but state governments began rolling out new licensing requirements. In 39 states and in DC, braiders are required to obtain a license. The necessary hours required for such a license ranges from a doable 6 in South Carolina and a whopping 2,100 hours in Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota. And in 24 states, hair braiders are required to get costly and time-consuming cosmetology licenses, which can cost $5,000 to $20,000. And they learn little about braiding, instead made to learn skills that they have no desire to use. So what about black hair products? In the early 90s, Shark Products, a white-owned company, was producing the popular line of African Pride hair products. They sued two companies, Africa Natural and Mother Africa, both black-owned, because they used the word African and had the colors red, black, and green in their ads. One lawsuit settled out of court and the other case was dropped. In response, in 1994, members of the American Health and Beauty AIDS Institute put out an ad to deter black consumers from buying African Pride. They said, the best way to be sure the products you buy are manufactured by a black company is to look for the proud lady, unveiling a new symbol, the abai. The institute had been founded in 1981 to help black-owned businesses thrive in the growing consumer market. A 1996 study found that black women spent 3 times as much money on hair care than white women, and a 1997 report revealed that black people spent $225 million annually on hair weaving services and products. 4 years earlier, the Washington Post pointed out that hair care companies owned by African Americans captured 60% of the $390 million ethnic hair care category last year, an improvement from the late 80s, when black-owned firms had about 50% of the market. But in the 90s, as the Shark Products fiasco showed, more non-black owned companies were trying to take a piece of the pie. For example, Revlon unveiled its poorly named and quickly scrapped Kente Creations. Johnson Products, which had been the instrumental creator of Afro Sheen and one of Abai's biggest members, was sold to a white-owned manufacturing company. Meanwhile, Revlon purchased African Pride in 1998, and Shark Products CEO Brian Marks went on to create Dr. Miracles. That company, which I'm sure a bunch of us remember, was again littered with black motifs because it was definitely for black women. By this time, many black hair companies were selling to conglomerates and not just white ones. Asian ownership of the black hair care market would grow to 45 to 60% in the modern day. Asians, particularly Koreans, also began establishing their foothold in black beauty supply stores in the late 90s and early 2000s. It's estimated that Korean Americans, who got their leg in the door due to their connections with the Korean and Indian hair markets, own approximately 70% of beauty supply stores nationwide. This outsider ownership of such a sacred and typically black-peddled commodity has harmed black-Asian relations. During the 1992 LA riots, a response to the beating of Rodney King and the murder of Latasha Harlins by a Korean convenience store owner, many of the Korean-owned stores destroyed were beauty supplies. In the modern day, less than 10% of black beauty supply stores are owned by black women. To close out the 90s, in 1998, a white teacher in Bushwick, Brooklyn, then described by the Washington Post as a gritty black and Hispanic neighborhood notorious for drugs and graffiti, which is crazy if you've been to Bushwick lately, outraged black parents when she read the book Nappy Hair to her 3rd grade students. The book, which affirmed nappy hair and sought to destigmatize both the word and kinky tresses, would go on to sell over 100,000 copies. The white teacher resigned from her job before the outrage died down. The next year, 2 of 19-year-old Venus Williams' signature beads came off of her braids during a match in the Australian Open. After the second bead fell, the umpire penalized Williams a point for causing a disturbance, prompting her to yell at him. There's no disturbance, no one's being disturbed. She was booed by the crowd and, frustrated and unfocused, lost the match. The hair of Serena and Venus Williams had been contentious since they entered the scene in the mid-90s, and the braids of beads secured with aluminum foil and or rubber bands were eventually replaced after this incident. To be fair, I remember how unpleasant it was when my beads and plastic bows would smack me me in the eyes and face as a youth. So I doubt the Williams sisters, who were doing a bunch more moving in the court than I was, missed their beads. In the next decade, the internet would make black women's hair culture more accessible, while black people simultaneously continued to dominate media. In the first half of the decade, the importance of the black salon and barbershop would be fictionalized in Nora's Hair Salon, Hair Show, the Ice Cube created barbershop franchise, featuring the world's worst argument against reparations. Seriously, if you forgot that scene, go and run it back because it's awful. And one of my favorite problematic Queen Latifah movies, Beauty Shop. These movies saw the main characters grappling with the struggles of owning these cornerstones of black culture in modern society. And by the way, speaking of Queen Latifah, she has always been a hairstyle icon for me since her debut in 1989, and her living single character, Khadijah James, stayed with her hair laid and with a fine man, but we gonna move it on. Anyways, the salons. By the second half of the 2000s, salons would be facing even more competition and pressure than ever before. As early as 1999, the competition between black and Dominican salons in urban centers was reported, with Dominican blowout services believed to be quicker, healthier on the hair, and cheaper. Reported the New York Times, a wash and set at a Dominican salon might cost as little as $10 or $15, while an African American salon on average charges twice that or more. Next, the rise of African immigration in the 90s meant more braiders and people getting accustomed to super cheap braids done by multiple people. And two more things would impact the hairstylist client culture forever: being able to learn how to do your own hair thanks to YouTube University, and the natural hair movement. Joan Clayton, the fictional lawyer played by Tracee Ellis Ross on Girlfriends, rocked a large natural do that was almost as symbolically powerful as Erykah Alexander's Maxine Shaw, a well-paid, fashionable, and groundbreaking dark-skinned and dreadlocked lawyer on Living Single. From the mid-90s onward, neo-soul and R&B stars from Jill Scott to Erykah Badu to India.Arie to Alicia Keys were reflecting and inspiring a growing natural hair movement that would only be strengthened by the internet. But what constituted natural depended on the person. For instance, Erykah Badu was criticized in 2000 when her dreadlocks were revealed to be fake. This would continue and sharpen arguments by Rastafarians that black Americans were appropriating dreadlocks and disconnected from the spiritual aspect of them. Badu, saying "this hair don't make me," shaved her head bald. Sang India.Arie in her 2006 song "I Am Not My Hair." Little girl with the press and curl. Age 8, I got a Jherri curl. 13, and I got a relaxer. I was a source of so much laughter. At 15, when it all broke off, 18, and went all natural. By the early 2010s, there were thousands of black blogs discussing everything from the damage of relaxers to how to navigate life after the big chop. It's been speculated that the embrace of natural hair was aided by the 2009 recession, and it's estimated that between 2008 and 2010, hundreds of black hair salons across the country closed. But for those of us who grew up in less progressive eras, coming to terms with our natural hair was a slow process. In the 2000s, straight hair continued to rule as the supreme form of black beauty in Charlotte, North Carolina when I was coming of age. Nappy also continued to be a pejorative term. All of the salons I went to were black owned, and all of the beauty supply stores I went to were Asian owned. My grandfather, a restaurateur and tire shop owner, had briefly tried opening his own beauty supply store but couldn't compete. Very few teen girls or adult women I knew wore afros, but straight hair, wigs, and braids were the common choice. Dreadlocks too. Meanwhile, I had received my first relaxer tragically when I was 3 years old. I had to wear swimming caps and told not to sweat out my roots so my hair wouldn't turn back. I remember the frustration of wrapping my doobied hair before bed and waking up with my scarf off the following morning. And when my kitchen, or the new growth, got unruly, a hot comb, and later the goddess of straightening with less chance to burn me, the flat iron, was taken to it. When I tell y'all, I used to be so scared when my mama would come to me and be like it was time for the hot comb. I would not be looking forward to like peeling down my ears so that she could get the little corners. Oh my God. The worst memories. When I was 5, I begged my mom for Scary Spice Bantu knots and suffered through their installation and got teased at school the next day relentlessly, so I undid them before I got home and got in trouble. And when I was 9 or 10, I washed my hair at a friend's sleepover thinking it would remain straight if I simply blow dried it and combed it. It did not. When I was 11, I was removing my cornrows while watching the queen of 2000s black teen hairstyles, Raven-Symoné, on That's So Raven, when I accidentally cut off most of my hair in the back. My Nana's hairstylist saved it by giving me the newly famous Rihanna bob, which several family members and teachers admonished as too grown for my 6th grade self. In 2007, CBS radio host John Imus called the 9 black players of the Rutgers University women's basketball team nappy-headed hoes, which led to numerous advertisers jumping ship and him getting fired. 2 years later, I remember watching Good Hair, the documentary by Chris Rock, and being slightly disturbed by the toxicity of creamy crack, but not enough to want to stop getting relaxers. The criticism the movie garnered by black intellectuals who rightly pointed out Rock's lack of contextual analysis was not on my radar at that age. When I rewatched while researching for this video, I'm amused at how much of this history was left out in exchange for scenes of a white man getting Botox, wild projections and judgments from Al Sharpton, and awkward overproduced skits featuring Rock. However, as a youth, the movie did factor into my decision to go natural years later. But at the time when Good Hair came out, it was easy to put on clip-in ponytails with my straight hair, and nobody could call me nappy unless, of course, my curly edges weren't gelled down. I feel like everybody in the comments has these hair stories. Be sure to share them with me. You know, like, my scalp would itch and burn when I'd have clip-ins, like the bobby pins and clips, because it would burrow into my flesh. And like, I used to live in constant fear that I would be the victim of the misogynistic yet common event of a male student ripping someone's hairpiece off for amusement. I know that happened at everybody's school. It definitely happened at mine. I also remember how my clipped-on bun flew off during a trip to the amusement park Carowinds, which is funny now, but back then it was devastatingly embarrassing. The same year that Good Hair dropped, Solange Knowles cut off her hair, leading to ableist gossip blogs still shook over the Britney Spears head shaving incident to call her insane and crazy. And in 2012, I remember 2-time Olympic gold medalist Gabby Douglas being criticized by some black Twitter users for not having pristine hair when performing a fucking gymnastics routine. So if I grew up with all of that, plus the years of my ancestors' hair traumas, it's no wonder it took me a while to get around to natural hair. By the time I was 17, I was also wearing quick weaves that my best friend installed by gluing tracks onto my head, my braided hair tucked under a wig cap, and I shudder knowing I went to college with an invisible part. Do y'all remember those? Oh my God, I had an invisible part. It was huge. You could walk across that shit. You could swim across that invisible part. It wasn't until 2013 that a good friend who went natural convinced me to give it a try. Shout out to Nadia. Of course, her suggestion was made more prudent by the fact that I permed my tresses for the first time in college and broke all my hair off. That would not be my last time damaging my hair, but doing the big chop would begin my love affair with my natural self. This same metamorphosis was happening on a larger scale in the personal lives of black women and in the depiction of them on screen. The 2014 drama How to Get Away with Murder caused water cooler fodder when the main character lawyer Annalise Keating, portrayed by Viola Davis, removed her wig. The next year, when Zendaya's red carpet dreadlocks prompted Juliana Rancic to speculate that she looked like she smelled like weed and patchouli, women rallied behind her online and dragged the E! News host. Back in 2011, Rihanna had responded to a Twitter user asking why her hair was nappy with a sizzling "because I'm black, bitch." And we can't forget how many people went up for Blue Ivy when people were coming at Beyonce and Jay-Z over her hair in 2013. 10 years later, the stigma of natural hair seems to be at an all-time low. And during that period, a flourishing natural hair care industry emerged, similar to the one of the early 70s, with black-owned startups like Carol's Daughter becoming white-owned, and every company from Revlon to L'Oreal creating a natural hair care line to compete with smaller black-owned businesses. Like in the case of Asian American dominance of black beauty supply stores, where they have supplier connections and better access to capital, corporations have the means to create dupes of black-owned products, market them at a higher rate, and sell them for a cheaper price. To deal with the sheer volume of products available, a bustling natural hair care video industry guided the curious on YouTube, alongside videos that taught people how to braid hair, install convincing sew-ins, and a bunch of other hair feats that were once only achievable with years of training. And the best part was, YouTube was free. And when black hair product companies that gained massive followings thanks to hair blogs and YouTubers became no longer black-owned and marketed towards a more inclusive audience, hair formulas changed, like in the case of Shea Moisture. And because numerous black-owned hair companies have made it clear that they'll sell as soon as their company is eligible for a massive buyout so they can skip the stress of competing with major corporations, it has become the norm for most of us to go with the product specifically targeted at black hair that works for us and what is cost effective and available, rather than what is targeted at black hair and black owned. During this multifaceted 2010s era, as natural hair became more lucrative, it was also much more embraced, more protected and discussed, and a lot less ridiculed, especially on the internet in spaces like the colloquially coined Team Natural and Shea Butter Twitter, where women who wore natural hair and or identified as feminists melted into a community whose existence was used as an insult hurled by misogynists and pick-me's. Don't make Shea Butter Twitter mad, they guffawed when someone made a rape joke or said something colorist. But natural hair, of course, was not just limited to the social justice warriors and the shea butter feminists, just as the Afro of the late 60s and 70s wasn't limited to revolutionaries. In 2018, it was reported that 71% of black adults wore their natural hair at least once in 2016, and black spending on relaxers dropped 30.8% between 2011 and 2016. Even still, there are those who believe only certain natural hair textures are professional or beautiful, prioritizing 3A to 3C hair over 4A to 4C curls and kinks. Some people would spend hours on wash day doing particular treatments and manipulations to coax their hair texture to be more desirable, a trend which thankfully seems to be dying out in recent years. There are people who continue to hold the belief that natural hair is inferior. There's the camp who accuse black women of being self-hating for wearing hair hats, aka wigs. And me personally, I'm just glad the wig technology has come a long way and that there are so many good synthetic ones, because me personally, I'm gonna wear a hair hat, okay? Shout out to the hair hats. But natural hair versus weaves isn't the only thing that sparks intense debate. What color femmes choose to wear is also under scrutiny. Think of the angry purple-haired feminist stereotype, the rainbow colors as ghetto stereotype, and the blonde as self-hating or not for dark-skinned people lies. For over a century, these arguments about what black femmes do to their hair have raged on. And in the past decade, and as recently as last year, private schools, nonprofits, and companies have punished, suspended, or attempted to fire/expel black people with braids, afros, dreadlocks, or colored hair. And thanks to black people still obsessed with respectability politics, like when in 2021, the comedian and actress Monique criticized black women who wear bonnets in public, clearly, we have a long way to go when it comes to respecting black people, particularly black women's hair choices. Just last fall, it was reported in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute that black women who use chemical hair straighteners and relaxers may have a higher risk of uterine cancer. In a study of black and white women, black women are 3 times more likely to develop uterine fibroids than white ones, and black women are roughly 60% of the hair relaxer market, though thankfully, it's dwindling. Sales have dropped from 71 million in 2011 to 30 million in 2021. I'm glad that this knowledge about hair relaxers being harmful will help many of us make more fruitful choices in the future, but I can't help but weep for past generations of women and current people suffering from uterine cancer and fibroids because they used relaxers. I personally hope that the 15 years of relaxers I endured won't have long-term impacts on my health. But what about black women and femmes who still feel the need to straighten? Not just because of a personal styling choice or for convenience, but because it makes surviving in America easier. In 2016, when looking for employment in New York with the purple afro, I got denied in several food and retail and kitchen positions. And when a friend hired me at a gym, she had me wear a straight wig at the interview and during orientation, knowing they wouldn't be able to fire me if I took the wig off after a week or 2 of employment. But knowing that they would have fired me or not even hired me if I had shown up with my hair in an afro still fills me with rage. You should have seen me walking around when I took that wig off. That week after, I was putting that thing in everybody's face. The widespread belief that natural hair is inferior, which impacts black people's employment opportunities and further intensifies racial profiling, has only recently begun being legislated. The 2019 California Crown Act was the first legislation passed at the state level banning discrimination of hairstyles and textures that are associated with a specific race or nationality. CROWN stands for Create a Respectful and Open Workplace for Natural Hair, and similar laws passed shortly after after in New York, New Jersey, Washington, Maryland, Virginia, and Colorado. A Crown Act was introduced in South Carolina but failed to be ratified. And the Crown Act would be introduced at the national level in 2020 and 2021 but failed to be passed both times. However, while the 2021 attempt was ultimately blocked by the Senate Republicans, it was passed by the House, showing that this may eventually become national law. And it would be about damn time for our hair to be protected on a national level, as Black people's hairstyles and even our methods of hair care are, depending on where you stand, are being appropriated and or appreciated by other races. I really love discussing a Black woman's history of hair with you guys, and believe me, this video could have been 10 times longer with a lot more topics, but you know, I had to end it eventually. I hope to explore more topics from our unique point of view while bringing up my own personal journeys and struggles growing up as a Black girl. For all of my Black women and femmes, what was your defining hair moment growing up? Who was your hairstyle hero? If you enjoyed this episode, please like and leave a comment telling me what other topics you'd like for me to dive into with an explicit focus on Black women. Also, shout out to MD Hair for sponsoring this video. Again, ooh, this is past Lexi. I can't wait to see future Lexi with that fresh hair. Let's go. But like I said, if you enjoyed this video, you can also consider joining my Patreon to support long format videos just like these for $1 a month. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you like and subscribe.